I remember that day vividly. The day my ordinary trip turned into an airport horror story. It started like any other journey, but it quickly spiraled into a nightmare that I'll never forget. I was excited to visit my family after a long year of being apart. The flight was set to depart from a bustling international airport, and I had arrived early to avoid any last-minute hassles. As I waited in the crowded security line, I noticed a young woman frantically pacing back and forth. She looked distressed and on the verge of tears, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. She approached me, her eyes wide with desperation, and handed me the note. It read, "Help me. He's following me." Confused and concerned, I looked around but saw no immediate threat. I motioned for her to stay close, thinking we could approach airport security together. She whispered her name was Emily and explained that a man had been stalking her for days. She had no idea who he was or why he was fixated on her. As we approached security, the situation took a dangerous turn. The man she had described appeared out of nowhere. He was disheveled, with a wild look in his eyes. In a panic, we told a security officer about the situation. They acted immediately, separating Emily from the man and questioning both of them. It turned out the man had been following Emily, but he insisted he meant no harm. He claimed he was a private investigator hired by Emily's estranged husband, who was worried about her safety. The security officers allowed Emily to board her flight but kept a close eye on the situation. As I continued through security, I couldn't shake off the unsettling feeling that I had been a witness to something sinister. Little did I know that the horror story was far from over. My flight departed on schedule, and I thought I had left the airport drama behind. However, as the plane cruised at a high altitude, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing a change of plans. We were informed that due to a technical issue, we had to return to the airport for an emergency landing. I glanced out the window and my heart sank as I saw the familiar airport runway approaching. The emergency landing went relatively smoothly, and the airline staff assured us that the issue would be quickly resolved. Passengers were instructed to stay on the plane while maintenance crews inspected the aircraft. Hours turned into an unending wait, and I could sense the growing frustration and anxiety among my fellow passengers. It was then that I noticed a couple seated a few rows ahead of me who seemed particularly agitated. They were arguing loudly. The situation escalated rapidly when the man in the couple suddenly stood up and started shouting at the flight attendants. He claimed that his wife was having a medical emergency and needed immediate attention. The flight attendants rushed to assess the situation, and a passenger who identified as a doctor also offered assistance. The doctor and flight attendants did their best to stabilize her, but the scene was nothing short of terrifying. The pilot decided to evacuate the aircraft while the woman received medical attention. We disembarked onto the tarmac and the airport's emergency response teams were on hand to assist. The rest of us passengers were ushered into a holding area where we were told that our flight would be further delayed. As we waited anxiously, I couldn't help but notice that the same private investigator who had been following Emily earlier was also among the stranded passengers. He was sitting alone, his eyes darting around as if searching for someone. The eerie feeling that he might be connected to the unfolding events grew stronger. The wait had become agonizing and tensions were running high. Passengers were exhausted and frustrated, and the airport staff seemed overwhelmed. The situation was escalating into a chaotic and nightmarish scenario. Suddenly, a loud commotion erupted in the distance. I rushed over to see what was happening and was met with a horrifying sight. The man who had been following Emily was now involved in a physical altercation with another passenger. It seemed that he'd been searching for Emily, and this other passenger had confronted him. Security personnel rushed to break up the fight, but the man was relentless. He was screaming, "Where is she? Tell me where she is!" The entire scene was surreal and terrifying, and it became clear that this airport was not a safe place. The situation prompted airport security to take drastic measures. They evacuated the terminal. We were guided to a secure area away from the disturbing events unfolding just a few yards away. After what felt like an eternity, airport security managed to apprehend the private investigator who had been following Emily. The rest of us were eventually allowed to re-enter the terminal, but the ordeal had left a lasting imprint of fear and unease. It turned out that the private investigator had continued to pursue Emily, even at the airport. His actions had caused a chain reaction of fear that had spread throughout the terminal. It was supposed to be a straightforward business trip, but the events that unfolded at the airport that day were anything but ordinary. As I arrived at the bustling international terminal, I had no idea how bizarre things would become. I had a morning flight to catch, so I arrived early, only to find the check-in counter swarming with people. Passengers were in a state of frustration, shouting and arguing with the airline staff. I managed to find a free agent and inquired about the situation. It turned out that the airline's computer systems had crashed, which caused massive delays and cancellations. Passengers were furious, and the airport staff were struggling to maintain order. As the hours passed, it became clear that my flight was also affected, and I joined the long line of disgruntled travelers. While I waited, I noticed a woman nearby who was oddly calm. She was sitting quietly, and her eyes were fixed on her phone, and her behavior was strange. As my patience waned and my frustration grew, I couldn't help but glance in her direction from time to time. It was then that I noticed her discreetly exchanging messages with someone on her phone. Feeling increasingly uneasy, I decided to approach her and strike up a conversation. I introduced myself, and she responded in a friendly manner, though her eyes seemed to hold a secret. She mentioned that she was a travel blogger and often found herself in unpredictable situations like this one. As we talked, I learned that her name was Rebecca. She was traveling to a remote island to review a luxury resort. Her calm nature had a soothing effect, and I found myself sharing my own frustrations about the flight delays. Rebecca smiled and suggested that we make the most of the situation. She recommended exploring the airport, which had an interesting art gallery on display. Desperate to escape the commotion at the check-in counter, I agreed, and we set off to explore the terminal. The art gallery was indeed a serene and captivating space, filled with interesting sculptures and paintings. But the serenity was short-lived. As we strolled through the gallery, an ear-piercing alarm suddenly blared, and the emergency lights began to flash. Panic set in, and the few visitors in the gallery started to rush toward the exit. Rebecca and I joined the frantic crowd, desperately trying to make sense of the situation. It was then that an announcement came over the loudspeakers, instructing all passengers to evacuate the airport immediately. Confusion and fear gripped the crowd as we streamed toward the exits. Airport personnel directed us to a safe zone outside, away from the terminal. Once we were safely outside, the chaos became even more surreal. I noticed that the woman, Rebecca, had vanished. I looked around, searching for her, but she seemed to have disappeared into thin air. As the minutes turned into hours, the airport authorities remained tight-lipped about the reason for the evacuation. Passengers, including myself, were left bewildered and anxious, unsure of what had triggered the emergency. The situation grew even more bizarre when rumors started to circulate amongst the evacuees. Some claimed that a dangerous substance had been found in the terminal, while others whispered about a possible security threat. The uncertainty and fear in the crowd were palpable. Hours later, as we awaited updates, an announcement came over the loudspeakers, declaring the airport safe for re-entry. The passengers were allowed to return to the terminal, though the sense of unease lingered. I made my way back inside, my thoughts consumed by the strange disappearance of Rebecca. As I reached the check-in counter, I couldn't help but wonder whether she had been aware of the impending emergency and had vanished for a reason. My flight eventually departed, but I couldn't help but wonder about the strange woman I met at the airport, and if she had anything to do with the bizarre incidents that happened that day. I had traveled from Texas, just landed at an unfamiliar airport in Brazil after a long 10-hour flight as part of my international studies program abroad. It was late at night, and the terminal stood nearly deserted. My host had mixed up the dates of my arrivals, so I had to find a hotel to stay for the night before they could arrive in the morning to greet me. As a female who traveled often, I was always careful to not stay in empty or deserted areas for too long. I was more than eager to collect my luggage and head to my hotel for some much-needed rest. As I waited at the baggage carousel, I noticed a man standing a few feet away. He was disheveled, with a vacant look in his eyes. His skin was a sickly white, almost gray. I thought nothing of it at first, assuming he was just another tired traveler. But as the minutes passed, I grew increasingly uneasy. The man began to approach me slowly, his gaze never leaving me. He was mumbling something under his breath, perhaps in another language, since I couldn't comprehend what he was saying. I decided to speak. "Sir, are you okay?" I said softly. He stared at me for a moment, then shook his head and muttered almost inaudibly, "No, she will be here very soon." I was startled by his response, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something very bad was about to happen. I started to look around, hoping to spot an airport security officer, but the terminal remained eerily empty. When the man was just a few steps away, he suddenly lunged at me, grabbing my arm with surprising strength. He repeated his previous answer, this time with a cackle. "She will be here very soon." I screamed, and the few other travelers in the area turned their attention toward us, but nobody moved to help. In a panic, I managed to free myself from his grasp and darted away, rushing toward the airport exit. The man pursued me, and I was overcome with fear, wondering why this insane maniac was chasing after me. As I reached the exit, I finally spotted a police officer standing nearby. Out of breath, I rushed over and managed to explain the situation to the officer, pointing to the man who was still following me. The officer immediately approached the man, questioning his intentions. After several minutes, the police officer called for medical assistance, and the man was taken into custody for evaluation and treatment. The police officer explained the man had mistaken me for someone else. Apparently, his wife had tragically died in a plane crash that was scheduled to land at the airport several years ago. He had been waiting for her arrival, and the grief from his wife's death caused the man to spiral into a severe depression. As a result, he would occasionally visit the airport terminal at night, waiting for his deceased wife to return from her trip. His words, "No, she will be here very soon," now made sense to me, sadly. It took me more than an hour to hail a taxi and make it to my hotel that night. I was exhausted and felt dirty, like I had just been in a fight with a wild animal. I was really disturbed by what had happened, and made up my mind to never fly late at night ever again.